Hello, this is Coach Matt from Coach Matt's Online Chess Academy. And today we're going to talk about one of the most important things to talk about with beginner chess players. That is the four-move checkmate, known as the scholar's mate. Now, before we go further on it, I'm going to review one concept I talked about in my last video, which was about the F pawn. And if you remember, the F pawn, which is a pawn here on F2, is only being guarded by the king in this position to start a chess game, as is the pawn on F7 only being guarded by a king as well. However, the pawns on the squares like E2 and D2 are being guarded by so many different pieces that it is very, very well defended to start a chess game. So there are four defenders on both of those squares. So what I want to do now is I want to show you guys what happens, obviously, if we move this pawn forward and black moves his pawn forward one step and white moves his pawn forward here to G4, black can already win the game with a checkmate. And this game is already over. It's a two-move checkmate, and you can see how weak this particular square is on F2. So let's back up a second and talk about, first of all, what this four-move checkmate is. What it is basically is white will many times bring his pawn forward two steps to E4. Black will usually play something along the lines of pawn to E5. And then white will then respond by bringing his queen out to H5. And with the queen out here on H5, it's now attacking the F7 square and also the square on E5. Now, some of you might say, well, Coach Matt, this square over here on F7 isn't really in trouble because the king can just take that pawn. Well, that's true, but what's going to happen is eventually this bishop is going to come out, it's going to attack it again on that square, and we're going to throw it in a checkmate here in just four moves. So here in the situation, black can make lots of mistakes here. One mistake he can make is just ignore it and push a pawn or something random. And then white can immediately take this pawn in the middle and check the king, which is very, very strong, winning a pawn for free, forcing a blocking move like with a knight or a bishop or even with a queen. Now, to play this correctly for black, what you want to do, the best move is actually knight c6. That is going to defend the square here on e5. That way, if the queen tries to take it, the knight would just capture him back. Now, if white brings out the bishop out to c4, now his queen and his bishop are attacking the f7 square. So now we are really threatening a checkmate on the f7 square. So if black wants to respond here, many times black will play something like knight f6, and then you'll notice that in just four moves, white has won the game and played a checkmate. And now the king is in checkmate, protected by the bishop. There's nowhere to move here or to capture the queen, and the queen has that square covered. So everything is under control here, and white has won the game. So let's go back a little bit here and talk about this first move again. E4, E5, Queen H5. Now, in this next position, some students will play things like pawn G6, but that doesn't work well either because then the queen will take this pawn here, he'll check the king, and also fork the rook. And when black tries to block, the queen's going to take the rook for free. So again, going back to what our best move was that we talked about, was actually the move over here, which was knight out to c6. Now, once you play knight c6, white will respond with an idea like bishop c4. And now, with the knight defending the e5 square, it is now safe for black to play the next move, best move here, which is pawn to g6. Now, pawn g6 only works well if the knight is already on c6, guarding the pawn on e5, preventing the queen from taking it. So now if the queen goes back to f3, notice how the bishop and the queen are both attacking the f7 square, threatening another checkmate. Now, this move that we talked about earlier that was a mistake when the queen was on h5 is the knight is now okay to move to f6 as it's now being guarded by the queen. And now we're blocking the queen's ability to come down with a checkmate. So now, if white goes any further and tries to play another move to attack your f7 square, like queen to b3, now his queen and his bishop are creating a battery on the square on f7. Now, this is an interesting position that isn't talked about a lot, but actually, there's a very nice move that black can play here that really gives black a huge advantage. And it's not the most obvious move. I'm going to give you guys a moment to see if you can figure out the answer. Again, black to play here. What is the best move for black to play in this position? Okay, so the best move for black to play is actually not Queen E7. And that's the move that most coaches and most people will probably tell you to play. It does guard this square over here from the bishop taking it. But the actual best move here is actually going to be the move knight to D4. Now some of you say, well, Coach Matt, let's go back a second. If I play Queen E7, I'm guarding the square. You are, but what are you doing with this bishop over here? It's now getting blocked by the queen. It's getting more difficult for you to castle your king. That's something you don't want to do. So after we play the move here, knight to d4 in this situation instead, now you'll notice that we are attacking the queen. But some say, well, Coach Matt, this is terrible. I'm just going to take this pawn and laugh and say, haha, I got your pawn for free with check. Well, you can do that. You're right. But it's all part of your trap here, your master plan for black. If white overextends himself and takes the pawn with check, now it looks like black is really in trouble at first glance because his king cannot take the bishop because the queen has that protected, and he goes to e7. And for those of you that know chess well, you know the king cannot castle once he's moved. So it looks like now black cannot castle his king anymore. Well, look at white's problem. The knight on d4 is attacking the queen, and the king is also putting pressure on the bishop. So to keep the bishop not being captured, white needs to stay on this diagonal somewhere. You notice every square in this diagonal is covered by one of black's pieces, with the exception of the c4 square. So all you have to do for black is play pawn to b5, and then when you chase the queen away somewhere, now the king just takes the bishop for free. Now you say to me, well, Coach Matt, the king isn't really very safe. Well, look at white's position. He's got zero pieces that are developed at all but his queen. He has no good way to attack black's king at all, and black has plenty of time to even do like a castling by hand, where he can bring his bishop out, and then his rook out eventually, and then slide his king back to g8, and just do a castling by hand technique. So that's something you definitely can do here. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. For those of you interested in taking chess lessons online with me, please remember that you can become a great player. All it takes is hard work, patience, and persistence. Please contact me for my help by email at chess.coach.matt@gmail.com.